So what are we going to talk about today?
Yeah, so hey, today we are in chapter 4 of the Patient Ferment of the Early Church, among probably a whole host of other topics that this will bring up because I had another question I wanted to briefly talk about, but I think it really kind of fits this. And chapter 4, by the time this rolls out, the Facebook post I made on this will have been, I don't know, forever ago because I haven't even posted our last episode of this yet.
Right.
on on Facebook, after I reread chapter 4 in preparation for our conversation today. I just said, it wasn't the gathering, and I felt weird. I felt weird kind of phrasing this, and I'm not ultimately satisfied with the way I did it, but I wrote, in chapter 5, which is actually 4, Kreider writes that it wasn't the church's gathering that led to conversions and church growth, but it was, or rather, it was the habits and behaviors of individual Christians.
Right.
And I wrote that because, um, like when for us who live here in 2025, um, our our framework of the church gathering, and we've probably spent a lot of time talking about this, like our practical display of the church gathering would be, um, at least in the way that they met in homes, like what we do would not be recognizable in terms of, like, for us. So, and I guess I am interested in hearing your thoughts
Mhm.
on this, but like, the early church, at least the earliest early church, didn't meet in a big room with all the seats facing like one person up front because
Yep.
they met in people's homes
If they had seats.
if they had seats. Or they sat on the floor or they stood. You would say nope,
Yeah.
it's good. um but like that, so context, and then also people who weren't believers, if they were in the gathering, at some point they were excused because the rest of the gathering like wasn't for them. So if that's your, I don't know, model, um, like that's not a very good, I would say, and I'm using like 2025 words, like that's not a very good evangelistic model to invite people who aren't believers in and then kick them out at some point because
Mm.
it's not for them.
Mm.
So what they had, and I really liked the sentence. I really liked was, um, gotta find it. The sentence I really liked was, the churches did not seek attention, but instead propagated the gospel by other means. And what were they? And then that was when I talked about, well, they lived it out, like just living in their quote unquote neighborhood, being Christians. Like they interacted with people around them, and the way that they interacted was the thing that, um, I guess, you know, maybe drew their interest, or like however we would frame that.
What
So
page is that?
that was on page,
I can find
the
it.
bottom of page 78,
Oh yeah.
under
Okay.
that, under that
Yep.
Christians at home
Yep. Yep. Yep.
thing. The non-itinerant Christians had a characteristic approach to their day-to-day life, which was to keep a low profile.
Yeah.
I just think that that is a very, I don't know, that seems very countercultural, at least to maybe the evangelical model of the church, which is, I'm going to be, maybe, to borrow a phrase, I'm going to be loud and proud and
Hmm. I hear
out
you. I hear you.
in my presentation, and
Yeah.
maybe advertising the gospel or advertising my Christianity. I don't know. What do you think about that?
You ready to dive into it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, I think probably, I mean, bearing in mind, you're talking about a period where um where persecution of Christians
Mm,
comes and goes in a
mhm.
period where Christianity, I mean, really we're talking about the period where Christianity is not legalized. It's kind of hard for us to imagine that. Um you're dealing with people who in certain areas, not everywhere, but and not at all times, but certainly during certain times in certain places, the Christians are being persecuted. I mean, we see this in the book of Acts, to
Yeah.
some degree,
Yeah.
but also too, we have this in the history of well, we would say in the history of the saints and the martyrs. And there were those who, I think we talked about this last time, that were actively seeking out martyrdom. But then again, too, many were simply living and they were not necessarily didn't feel, I would put it this way, didn't feel a calling to martyrdom specifically. Some would say they did and some didn't. So really you were limited. I think by nature you were limited as what you could say. Again, you look at like, you look at cultures and places now like Soviet Russia, where Christianity was was very actively persecuted from time to time. And there were times where it was more. There was times where the government, honestly, I think, got bored with it and just did other things. And so people had to be very quiet about it. They would permit certain churches to serve services. I mean, it's Orthodox Church specifically, but oftentimes priests were not allowed to preach. Sometimes priests would get the position of being a priest, but I would have no training. They simply were allowed to serve the services, which we can do. The services themselves, we would say, are evangelical because they're preaching the gospel by nature. And of course, it's funny because, just thinking about that period, and you could probably say the same thing about the early days of the church. The people in charge didn't understand what they were hearing, and so the gospel could, in a sense, be preached. I mean, you would see this in the Soviet Union, and it was done almost right under the nose, sometimes of observers from the KGB, from the was it the CSB, these other things that existed, who didn't. They were just there because they wanted to make sure these troublesome priests didn't say things contrary to the state. And meanwhile, the priests were able, in some ways, to keep presenting the gospel. So you have like these possibilities, but by nature, like what we would probably call evangelism proper now, street corner preaching maybe is
Yeah.
an extreme version. Having, seminars, opening up, putting up flyers and say, come join us at church or whatever, and doing things online. These things would not have happened. It would have been all word of mouth. And it would have been obviously too, he talks about habitus, about the ways that people were living, the traditions, I would say the traditions of the church, where they would see these weird people do weird things culturally. Like who's going to save? Why are these guys saving, infants that had been left out to be exposed and die? Why were they going in? Why were these weird people going into plague-ridden places and bringing these sick people back home where normally, and we see this in the scripture where like, the sick people, the those with leprosy, they were all pushed out for the sake of saving a community. These Christians would go in and do this. So they're doing weird stuff. People can't help but look at them and go, there's something different going on here.
It's funny. I actually almost I almost use that word weird
Mhm.
in the exact same way, is that
Yeah.
Christians they did weird things.
Mhm.
Um, they did countercultural things. Um, you know, basically loving, honoring, and serving people who were believers. But then also loving, honoring, and serving people who weren't believers. And it was those things rather than maybe we would say, like, rather than an attractional church model, which, like, they had no concept of that.
Yeah.
Than an attractional church model, um, they just lived out their faith.
But you do, I mean, you still do see things. And I think it's kind of interesting because a lot of this is a lot of this is really applicable to right now, particularly in Orthodox Christianity, where I mean, for us, I think it seems like a very strange period of time for Orthodox Christians because we, I mean, it's not like we're intentionally trying to push people away. We don't have, we don't have this, we have missionaries, we have missions. My church is a mission church, you know. So in one sense, our church is missionary. Um, we are hesitant to go out into the public sphere in the way that is probably typical. We're not driven, we're not driven to evangelize in the sense that I grew up with, where it was like, if I, you know, if I don't say this thing that, you know, to convince this person of something, then it will be my fault. They'll go to hell. Go to hell. This is obviously not ubiquitous to all evangelical stuff, but certainly there's a part of a sense of responsibility and guilt sometimes implied to this. And I think what we see, I think what he's pointing out here is that we see that the task, evangelism ought to be, um, it ought to be a natural outgrowth of how we're worshiping, um, of how we are, whatever the habitus of the community is. I think using his terminology, and it's just a different thing. I mean, I think that I mean, admittedly, when I became Orthodox, probably one of the greatest elements of relief to me was I didn't have the sense that I was responsible to save the world anymore. My task was, I mean, in Orthodox terms, we would say, my task is to be saved myself. And in the process of that, when that's happening, the people around me won't be able to avoid it if that's really happening. And the ones that God is prepared to receive it, they will also be changed by that, which is not to say, you know, I think for Christians in general, like we have the opportunity now to freely speak. You know, we should be open about Christ. So while we have that freedom, let's use that freedom.
Right.
If all that
Yeah.
makes
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah. 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 I would agree. I think, I know I've talked about just what the reality of all we can do is proclaim Christ, and like we're not responsible for the way people respond or don't respond. And I think if we're and to me that is a very that's a very freeing concept, because as you said, then someone's salvation like isn't dependent on whether or not like I say the right phrase or the wrong phrase.
Mm.
um and that can be a really freeing thing for us. And i I would love it if like if that's something that would take root in living out, in our I guess at least in our people living out their faith. So my screen is frozen. Is your screen frozen?
No, I mean you're frozen on my end, but I can hear you just fine. And it's
Okay.
a nice look. I mean,
Hey.
it's very serious, you know. If I could try
Yeah,
to imitate you, I wonder if I could do that.
that's going to be
There you go.
there we go. That'll be the screenshot for our video. Is that
I
me?
like it. I like it. I mean, it's a big, I mean, it's a big deal. I mean, it's interesting because, you know, again, like when I read this book, I'm like, okay, what's he getting at here? And he makes some comments in this chapter where I'm kind of like, I would quibble with it in some places where I'm like, I don't think you're understanding exactly what's happening here. But I think it's partly because I think what he's trying to communicate through this is the fact that ultimately, you know, it's Christ who's doing the saving, and our task is to really live out and to embody this faith. So that I think on one hand, we're inspired to want to share it with people. Like I said, when I became Orthodox, for me, it relieved me of the pressure, and I think it was the wrong kind of pressure, the wrong sense of what it meant to share your faith, and in a way that I felt was like it was so pushy, you know. And it gave me something that I fell in love with. That, and then I was like, I want people to know this. I want people to understand this. But I also know at the same time, like I'm not, while I'm responsible to make use of those opportunities that God gives in those places, my job then is to recognize those places. And usually what I find for myself is like I'm a lot more comfortable. being able, even in difficult places, to say, this is what I believe, this is what's changed me, because no longer is it about like, this constant, like I have to be as brave as, like, for instance, my father-in-law, who I love and who's an amazing guy, he used to go door to door witnessing to people. And he took me along at one point years ago. And as an Orthodox Christian now, I'm just kind of like, nah, we don't do that. But like then I felt like I really should do this because like he's doing it and it seems like the right thing. And he's totally comfortable with that sort of thing. And I'm exceedingly uncomfortable. And so on two levels, there's some problems with it. I think I would argue with him about a little bit. I don't know that he does it anymore, but he's very open with people about his faith. But I think there's such a priority put on that, I would say, in evangelicalism. It's part of the name, to say, well, that's the right way to do it, or like that's the best way to do it. Whereas I think what Kreider is trying to say is if we look at the past, I mean, they didn't have any concept of this at the time. They just didn't. It
Right.
wasn't how it was. Like none of what we would look at today in modern, particularly Western, particularly Protestant evangelical Christianity, like that part of it, they would not, I don't think they would recognize that part of it. Although Paul in the Areopagus, he's up there, he knows, got his hand up in the air and he's preaching, so there is that.
Mhm.
So, but it's just I think it's a different thing. And there's a priority that needs to be, I would say, shifted,
Yeah.
a weight shifted to another part of this. That's what I think he's getting at.
Yeah. And one of the things that was challenging for me as I was rereading through this chapter, and I made that post on my Facebook page, it kind of made me think like, well, isn't in a way, isn't the thing that he is, I don't know, talking about, like churches did not seek attention. Like there was a little bit of a ironic thought in my brain that I'm posting something online in a way that, I mean, does you could easily argue like does seek attention.
Mm.
So there was a little bit of I don't know, I don't know if this is a word, discongruence for me
Yeah,
in
I know what you're talking
in doing that.
about.
Um, but I also think that as much as this kind of model mindset reality is what it is, and as much as it frees us from like, oh man, I have to make sure I say the right thing and don't say the wrong thing,
Yep.
I also think there's an element of that this puts a lot of like, sorry, my throat's a little
Mm.
crazy. Um, like in some ways, I think it actually puts more responsibility on me from a like maybe a behavioral standpoint.
You think?
Yeah, and that's what I was thinking about as I was reading this
Um,
too. Like it's not a get out of jail free card. It's
yeah.
not it's
Yep.
not church, it's not that there's no purpose for the church or the gathering. It's not, and just because then I'm free from the pressure of saying the right thing or wrong thing, like that doesn't let me off the hook in any way, shape, or form. I would say, in fact, it
I lost you.
prep and not so much like not so much on whether or not I'm going to say the right thing or the wrong thing, but there's an increased amount of pressure for me to make sure like I'm truly living in a way that demonstrates integrity
Right.
around with the people around me.
Yep. Yep. I lost you for 1 second there, but I got most of that.
Okay.
I mean, I just think about it too in terms of like you said, it's not, we don't get a, especially as pastors, like you don't get a pass, we're up there,
Yeah.
we got to live it out even more so. And you think about that. I mean, even in the scripture and what St. Paul talks about with the qualifications for, let not many of you become teachers, like really, because the problem with that is not because he thinks we don't need many teachers. It's just that the responsibility is so great and the potential for failure and for, we were reading, what were we reading this week? I was reading, was it Hebrews? I'm trying to think where it talks about hanging the millstone around your neck. Better that you not, well, it's not that. I'm sorry, it was the Gospels. I'm trying to think. Was it Mark where Christ says, better that you have a, if you're going to lead these little ones astray, better that a millstone be hung around your neck and you be thrown to the ocean. I mean, that's terrible. What a crazy image.
Mm,
So it's not, I think part of this picture is that worship, the Christian life, I mean, we know this, but we really need to know it more, it's not primarily in the head, you know. Um, it's it's not just like what we tend to think of as like this mental exercise. And it's more in the heart and it's more in the hands. Speaking as someone who really ought to probably be doing more, living this out in a lot of ways. So I mean, again, I'm just bringing condemnation on myself in the process. But that being said, it has to be said.
mm.
It just, yeah, it's just you look at, I mean, not to point at other fingers at other pastors, but you look at pastors who have failed, like big name ones who have failed, and it seems like it's like one after the other. It doesn't matter if it's like, like somebody in the Baptist church or somebody in a big, huge, non-denominational whatever mega church. It's like it's all over the place, and that does such damage to people's faith. But it also too can shake people free and go, it's not people I should be trusting here. It's Christ, and so we're all
Right,
responsible for that.
right.
Behavior's a big deal. It's a really big,
Yeah,
it's a really big deal.
yeah, yeah. The pressure goes away in one sense, but then
Yeah,
there's more of it
yeah, yeah,
to really make sure I hesitant to say, we get it right because
yeah. Well, I mean, there ought to be. I mean, he talks in here. I think about what does he get into here? I made some notes too. He talked about, although I might be conflating with something else I was reading. He was talking about qualities, but I might be thinking of something else. I can't find it right off the top of my head. Um, I mean, of course, his chapter really isn't about that sort of thing altogether. It's more about like I think was, in a sense, the visibility of the community and kind of how. I mean, it seems like in the book he's really getting at sort of a rethinking of evangelism of how the church grows. As an Orthodox Christian, much of it resonates. Some of it I'm kind of like, yeah, that's what we do. Some of them like, I mean, I get what he's going for. And in this too, particularly this chapter, which I only read about half the chapter and I made a bunch of notes on that half.
Mhm.
But just that the visibility or lack thereof, and even the things that are, like you said, were contrary, like where, like even in the divine liturgy today in the Orthodox Church, we have a dismissal in the middle of the service where we send technically, although we don't do this as much. Um, My cat's trying to get in here. If you can hear him. Anyway, he can't get in here. Um, where we dismiss the catechumens. The idea would be, I think I've mentioned this before, they would leave and they would
Yeah,
not be in the latter half of the service, which is the communion part of the service. And they would technically, and I wonder about the early church, even though we talk about like how they would remove all those who weren't communing, but I do wonder even then if maybe people still kind of knew, but then they would have to leave to be taught
yeah.
while the latter half of the service was going on, while communion was going on. And that was to protect them from misunderstanding things. It was to protect the other people from misunderstanding things. And yet still we have witnesses who would say, well, this is what the Christians are doing. Here's what's actually happening during that period, even though people they've literally, they've shut the doors, they put out the people who are not supposed to be seeing this.
Mhm.
We have that to this day in the Orthodox liturgies. But even for us, we don't send them unless we have someone to teach them, we don't send them out. They would be dismissed, sometimes going into the narthex, sometimes going to a class, other times not going anywhere. But it's still there. It's still present. That idea is still present that there are things that are only understood ultimately by participation. And everything else, like even just learning about it or visibly seeing it, some of it's not going to make sense until you can do it. And that's what I think we talked about that a bit last time.
Yeah, yeah.
It seems weird though, especially if like we're trying to say, do all these, come in, be a part of this church. And like, I guess I was getting this earlier too. It's been amazing to me, like, especially in Orthodoxy, which is not, um, it's not easy. I mean, it's not, I don't know how else to put it. It's not because Christianity isn't supposed to be easy, but what you feel like you're actually sometimes trying to make it easier for people. And they're like, I don't want it easier. Give me the whole thing. Show me the hard work I have to do.
Mhm.
And they respond so often to that, like with even more energy. And that's interesting to see. I think that's kind of what he's getting at here, where you've got pagans who are seeing Christians who are not necessarily not necessarily even being completely open, publicly saying, "Hey, I'm a Christian." They're just living this life, and people are like, "Tell me your secret. What is it that's making you so different?"
Yeah.
That's a big deal.
And the answer was hours and hours and hours of being with my being with my Christian brothers and
Yeah,
sisters
yeah,
and
yeah,
the work of that. And
yeah.
yeah, I think we do live in a very, very strange time. Um, this is a nice little segue into a top. I think it's kind of relates to. I think it does relate to what you just talked about people wanting, like wanting deeper things and having a like a heightened interest in deeper things. Um, did you are you I'm sure I'm gonna make an assumption that you've heard of it. Um, but like there was a this I think it was either in December or the beginning of January. There was a guest by the name of excuse me, by the name of Wesley Huff on Joe Rogan's podcast.
I
Uh,
didn't watch it. I know what you're talking about
okay.
though.
Yeah. Um, like that like that long form communication um is is an interesting concept. I think in our time because that is something that people are ultimately interested in. And I don't know where I was going with that. Maybe I just wanted to
Yeah.
bring up the podcast. But I think but I think just like the people have an interest in deeper things.
Mm,
And I think this is what we part of what we talked about last time in I think the way I described it was like the Orthodox sun seems to be rising a bit,
it does.
yeah, of interest, and I don't know. I'm trying to just marry all of these thoughts together. So I guess ultimately there is something to people being interested in deeper things then, and what is the church's responsibility, whether it's the Orthodox Church or a church like ours or any other, I shouldn't say any other, um, churches that are interested in proclaiming the gospel and making disciples. I don't know, like what's the role of that, and how do we, I guess, maybe just navigate that the cultural moment where there is a heightened awareness and there is a heightened interest in spiritual things
Mm,
and in deeper things and in long form communication. Like I don't know, what does all of that look like?
yeah.
Um, and how are all of those things shaping the people that are not only in our churches, but the people who are outside of the church, and like how can the church speak into that cultural moment, encouraging our churches, our people to live out their faith, but at the same time knowing that it's not, I don't know, I'll pick a date. I'm just looking at this, scanning the bottom to find a date.
Yeah.
It's not AD 150.
Gotcha.
Um, where for the most part, like this just isn't our reality.
Yeah. Yeah. You froze again. It's really beautiful shot.
I don't know how do we work through that?
Um, you froze again there for a second. It was really great. It was a great image. You'll see it. Um, yeah, and I do wonder. I mean, it's interesting. Like with Rogan, like he's interested in these conversations, right? And I think we need to take advantage. I think as Christians, as I would say this in a generous sense, as people who call themselves Christians, I think that if we care about people and they open the door for conversation, that makes sense to share Christ with people. Um, and I think leaving the it's funny even in Orthodox circles, people can get very up in arms. We really gotta, like you said, there's sort of this Orthodox moment, and I think that's the case. But I think we've had them before, and I think it's going to come and go, and it's really not. I get a little bit as a former evangelical and a present Orthodox priest, I get a little bit up in arms about it because I'm like, been there, done that. I mean, it's up to the Lord. It's going to be what it is. But when those opportunities come, and mostly what they're going to, I've got friends who think on a big scale where it's like let's work on bringing the gospel to people who have great influence on others, and that makes some sense. So you got those who would say like somebody like Rogan, you know let's reach him because then I think the
Yeah,
idea is a good one, but I kind of question at the same time because then suddenly that's going to translate into lots of people becoming, we would say from the Orthodox perspective, Orthodox. Um, but does it really work like that? I don't know. I mean, do we really want it to work like that? I don't know. I still think so much of this, and I think it should be comforting to us, is the primary reality is how I get up in the morning, how I drive to work, what I do and say at work, how I treat my wife and my kids, or my husband and my kids, or my family. And then beyond that, not just some moralistic stuff. What is my life as a worshiping being like? And am I consistent with that? Um, I think that's how, that's how I became Orthodox. That's how I stayed a Christian, I think was seeing
yeah.
people around me, who lived in a specific way, from whom I could take encouragement to say, this is worth living this way. Certainly, that's why I became Orthodox because I saw just how much that changed people, even Christians around me that had been, Christian and other, like how much more growth was there. So, I mean, really, the witness is always going to be that. But I think we still, if people ask, I think we should be happy to offer what we think and then just trust the Lord to do the work. In the meantime, we feed the body. We gather, we worship, we participate in the liturgy, we serve other people. We're about the business of being the church.
Yeah. And I think that it seemed like there was a mindset for a long time of if I could, I don't know that anyone ever would ever say this about me, but I've heard that there can be a mindset of, oh, if I can just get my friend to come to church and like he or she will like hear the pastor's message. Like I said, I don't know that anyone has ever said this about me, but
I know what you mean.
they can just hear like the pastor's message or whatever. Like that'll work. And like my mindset in that is, well, actually, I think it would be better if you would just love them as your neighbor first. And like inviting them to church is great, but I'm not the one who like I don't live in your neighborhood.
Hmm.
I don't I don't work where you work. I'm not shopping at Walmart when you're shopping at Walmart with and you're around this person. Like you as an individual church person, like you have so much more influence in this person's life than anything like I possibly would have on a Sunday morning or in small group. So like really just trying to encourage them to like just be a Christian.
Yeah.
Like just live out your faith to to the best of your ability. And what about it? And what I mean by that is like empowered and under the influence of the Holy Spirit. Um, Nothing that you're doing of your own strength, but using the strength of God present in you through the Holy Spirit. Like this will work better if you're just a faithful Christian.
Yeah. Yeah.
And in conjunction, like bring them to church, and in conjunction, like I think God will make this work. But it'll be better if you just live out your faith
Yeah.
and demonstrate what that looks like to them
Yep.
in your every life, in your everyday life.
I think trying to not have, I mean, it sounds funny as Christians, like not have ulterior motives. Like the ulterior motive being, I want this person to, you know, as an Orthodox Christian, I would say become Orthodox, to convert to Orthodoxy. I've always said it. I think it's for everyone. You, everybody, my family, me, everybody. Not everybody's going to do it. That's in God's hands, and what that means is up to the Lord. The best thing I can do in the process is live this life as it's supposed to be lived. And if that's, if I'm an Orthodox Christian, I think in some ways the standard is this is not talking about anybody else but us. Like we've got a high standard put on us. If I'm not living that, then what good am I? Like what am I, if I'm trying to sell this Orthodox faith,
Mm,
I'm doing it a disservice. Now I was thinking while you're talking about this, I was thinking about a luxury song actually. So something my brother wrote, and I was thinking about this off of Trophies. Like for those who know luxury, the last song, "Gates of Paradise." Yeah, you familiar? And so it's interesting because he says, I was pulling it up because I want to read it. It always sticks in my brain. When you close your eyes, do you ever pray?
mm,
Because unbelievers, yes, she says, cuz unbelievers are strange. I loved a few, I remember their names, and you still think if they just had a taste,
mm,
there's sort of this implying that they will change, but they won't. And the point of it is not to say to give up. Um, he says, but they won't, I think. And I think getting past this idea that if we just could get them to do this or that, they would, convert, they would get saved, whatever, however we want to talk about this from our different traditions. And I think losing that, I would even say this is controversial, I know, but to stop trying to get people saved, don't do it. Focus on your salvation, focus on presenting the gospel, focus on being a witness, like an actual martyr, martyr being witness of what it
mm.
means to be a Christian, what you've given up in this life, not like bragging about it, but just like letting it be seen. And then simply letting the gospel do its work. And when people ask, then we can say, this is what the gospel says. For us, what that means for us is, and our conviction is, what that means is that someone is baptized and brought into the church, and they commune and they learn to live the life of Christ um, through doing. And immediately it's like we try to put things into their hands and say, and I say this as a priest who's failed to do this as I should, but to get them to work, like go to work, be like Adam in the garden, get to work. That's what God says on yourself, but also too to serve other people. I mean, really, I mean that's the secret, and I think that's the thing that in a lot of ways it's not a secret at all. It's been around from the beginning. That's what the Christians did. St. Paul would preach. He had a gift of evangelism in that sense of speaking. Some of us are called to that. Most of us aren't. But all of us can echo that, And I've got parishioners. I don't think I'm telling secrets. Parishioners who struggle like, why when I talk to people at work, why won't they come to church? Why aren't they, I'm like, well, first of all, you're talking about orthodoxy. So this is a step for some people. Some people it's like just resonates. Others it takes time. Others won't. I'm like, stop trying. Just go to work. Just be at work.
Yeah.
Give a sympathetic ear.
Yeah.
If they need help, help them. Clothe the naked, help to heal the sick, feed the
Hmm.
hungry.
Hmm.
That's not like some sort of social gospel or anything else. It's just Christ's life lived out. It's simpler than we make it, and it's a lot less about up here, and it's much more, like I said, much more in here.
Yeah. I think I don't know if it was last year. Um, I'll say recently, which means, I mean, it could have been 7 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think like that's how old I am, is like
Mm,
it all runs together.
yep.
I remember at one point I just said, when we're demonstrating our faith, I just said, like, just don't be weird. I mean,
Yep.
just don't be weird. Just
Yeah.
just be a I like the way you framed it. Like, just be a normal person.
Yep.
Just be normal.
Yep.
Um,
My brother's parish, that's one of his favorite sayings, apparently. They bought him a mug and I think it said, be orthodox, but don't be too weird. And that's because he's trying to communicate that. Like we really, I think for the orthodox, we can replace one set of what I might say is poor habits, evangelically with another set. Like we want to replace this and we want to just flavor it with that.
yeah,
And it's not what people need.
yeah.
They need Christ, and Christ isn't summed up. I mean, what is he summed up by? I mean, the summary people get is like how do we behave? What is it? How do I react in really negative situations? I'm always, yeah, I'm nervous about myself because I'm like, I know my temper. And I think, it's like the things I hope I'm not tested in because I'm pretty sure I'm going to fail. But those are the areas where, I mean, when people see us mess up and how are we? Are we gracious? Is, and that seems very basic. I mean, the book, he's really getting at something else, but just that sort of quiet, if patience is the right word for this thing, it's the dependence that God is going to do the work, and we would use the word in synergy. We would say this, the in synergy with us as Christians, with us who call on him as Lord, to do his work on the earth. He chooses to use us. That's why we have saints in the Orthodox Church. They're a witness of that.
Mhm.
Um, that's his choice. So, I mean, yeah. Anyway.
Well, I think we actually made it through. Well, we didn't talk about everything in here, and
Mm-mm.
that's okay. But I think we cut like just be normal. Like,
It's pretty straightforward, isn't it? Don't be weird. Don't be weird.
don't be weird.
I'm trying to think. Father Thomas Hopko. I quote him often. He had 55 maxims that someone asked him to like put together a list of like suggestions. And in
Mm.
there, I want to, let me see if I can find it real quick. Because he said, and it's easy to find online. You can look it up, 55 maxims for life, Father Thomas Hopko. I'm just gonna type that in. I wanted to find one. And he said, in one of them, this is actually in Father Chris Foley's church. He's got it on his website. Let's see if I can find the one I'm looking for. There's a lot of really, really great ones on here. I mean, simple things too. Things that you would say, is this really like, what is this the gospel? Well, I think it's the gospel lived out. Um, where does he say? He's got kind of grouped up. And there was one. I mean, there's really good stuff. Read the scriptures regularly. Really good, simple things.
Crazy talk.
One of them was like basically be a normal person, one of the human race, I think is what it said. I'm looking for it right here. It sounds so simple. There's only 55 of them. Why am I not seeing it? Be an ordinary, that's number 18 on this list. Be an ordinary person, one of the human race. And I think it comes right before be polite with everyone. First of all, family members. These things sound like just like trite until you think, well, this is the gospel. If you live out the gospel, he said, these are 55 things that I put together. Why 55? I don't know. Just seemed like what he came up with, I guess. But a lot of them are very basic and simple. But to be an ordinary person, one of the human race, other things never bring attention to yourself. Strange. But at the same time, like if we're trying to just sort of, we're trying to let Christ do the work, we're going to recede into the background and let him move forward. And it's very antithetical to like how we tend to think, like of selling the gospel. We're not doing any of that. We're here to manifest it, to worship God, to let that worship be a reflection of what the gospel says, and then to let it shape, like when we walk out of the church, are we bringing the paradise of God that we're supposed to be experiencing out into the world with us in order to change people around us? Or are we leaving that at church and then just going out and, wreaking havoc? Or are we doing something in between? Probably something in between usually.
Mhm.
Um, so, so there you go. Yeah. Little last word there. Be ordinary, one of the human race. Don't be weird. Don't be weird.
Don't be
Be
weird,
normal.
man.
Be
Don't be weird.
normal. Be normal. Just be normal.
Well, this is Two Pastors Talk with, we haven't done introductions in forever. I'm John Mulholland,
I'm Father James Bozeman.
and we're just two pastors who talk about things. So we will catch you next time on Two Pastors Talk, where we will talk about chapter 5 of the book, The Patient Ferment of the Early Church, subtitle, The Improbable Rise of Christianity in the Roman Empire. Thanks for listening to our madness. We encourage you to like, subscribe, etc., etc., and we'll catch you next time on this. See ya.